the survivors of Karbala. When he wanted to tell his crew to get on the horses.
Every year during the month of Muharram, detailed historical accounts of the tragedy of Husayn ibn Ali's martyrdom on the plain of Karbala are recited from pulpits at gatherings across the Muslim world. But what are the origins of those historical accounts? Who are the compilers of Islamic history as we know it today? And what were their motives for the accounts that they gave? In this program, I'll be investigating what we can learn about Husayn ibn Ali from the sources. I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Abdul Sheikh, teaching fellow in Islamic Studies at the University of Leeds, who specializes in Middle Eastern and Islamic history and civilization, and asking how Husayn ibn Ali is depicted in early accounts of Islam's history. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Abdul Sheikh, thank you very much for giving us your time for this interview. We're here in Leeds, and you're a lecturer at the University of Leeds. And I wanted to, again, thank you for your time.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to take part in this great venture.
You've specialized in particularly the medieval. Every year during the month of Muharram, detailed historical accounts of the tragedy of Husayn ibn Ali's martyrdom on the plain of Karbala are recited from pulpits at gatherings across the Muslim world. Medieval period of history, of religious history, Jewish, Christian, Muslim history, which inshallah we'll touch on. But I just wanted to go back a little bit earlier in history, and as has been said by certain historians, there's not a lot of information on the life of Imam Hussain alayhi salam from the time that he was a child up until the coming of the events of Karbala. Do you have any view on why that might be, why we have this gap in his life?
I think it's probably more to do with the historical context and the setting of that period in time. Obviously the Ahlulbayt is very much revered by all Muslims. Yeah. Around the world, but because of the rivalries, the establishment of dynasties, like the Umayyad dynasty, because there is this common saying that the victors always write history. Because the Umayyad Empire was quite dominant once it was established, it probably was more of a tendency to promote the credentials of Muawiyah the first and Yazid at the expense of Imam Hassan and Imam Hussain.
And also, just moving on to the issue with Muawiyah selecting Yazid as his successor. So there had been this agreement between Imam Hassan and Muawiyah. They had signed this agreement, and part of that agreement was that Muawiyah would not select Yazid as his successor, and implicitly would hand back power to the family of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him and his holy progeny. But we see that once Imam Hassan had died, and he died before Muawiyah did, then we see Muawiyah passing on the successorship to his son Yazid. What were the reasons for that?
I think Muawiyah, he knew that the Ahlul Bayt, was a major institution, and the figures, the personalities within the Ahlul Bayt are very much, well revered. Obviously, there was a schism between Muawiyah and Ali, radiallahu anhu. So ultimately, what you have is, I think Muawiyah, from my perspective, probably was torn that he told Yazid not to basically seek allegiance from Imam Hussain, because it was not a good idea. But I think Yazid, there's a lot of conjecture and a lot of discussion over the personality of Yazid, but ultimately power does strange things to different people. So again, one is trying to fight against ego, nepotism, potentially egotism and corruption. So ultimately, power does strange things to different people. So I think Yazid, even though he actually went against Muawiyah's wishes, and I think it was due to this sense that I'm the ruler, I've been given power, I will ask Imam Hussain to basically give me allegiance, when in fact it wasn't a very good idea. So I think ultimately, with the Umayyad Empire, it became more or less a dynasty rather than a theocracy, where you have father passing down power to the son.
Of course, we also see around that time the fact that Yazid came into power, and he did, although we know he was violent and coercing people to give their allegiance. Nevertheless, there is this issue of the fact that people did acknowledge him, or they did follow him.
I think ultimately, if you look at the situation from a historical perspective, what you find is the Umayyads were very much organized in terms of how to basically run a state, that they had developed the infrastructures of power. They had a powerful army, powerful navy. So ultimately they had the infrastructure in terms of how they could maintain control. And coincidentally, during the Umayyad period, within 125 years, the empire had expanded all the way to Spain, from the humble beginnings of the Islamic State in Medina. So the Umayyads were very, very clever, and also what assisted them in terms of building their power and control base and having authority is they learned from other civilizations, such as the Byzantine Empire and also the Sassanids, in terms of how to create the state. Because if you look at early Islam, you have a micro state in Medina during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Medinan constitution. So ultimately, the Umayyads were very clever, that they actually built the infrastructures by learning of other civilizations, and that allowed Yazid to basically tap into the power and the might that actually been built up very, very quickly. So I think military might allowed Yazid to basically fulfill his ambitions.
And also thinking about the whole events of Karbala. Large parts of the Muslim world today are still quite unaware of what happened at Karbala, or they're unaware of who Husayn bin Ali is. Do you think there are particular reasons as to why large parts of the Muslim world have been left unaware of that, or are there moves going on in different parts of the Muslim world to try to raise that awareness, or is it still, do you feel, quite a controversial event that
I think it's the reason why Husayn bin Ali is not given as much importance as he should be, due to the emergence and the entrenchment of Sunnism. And I'm a firm believer that it's always the victors that always write history, and it's no surprise to find out the Umayyad Empire was the first civilization. So ultimately they would have dictated how history was actually written. So obviously the Umayyads were in conflict with the family of Ahlulbayt. So it's no surprise to see that history, the Umayyad history, has so much glossed over the life and the personalities of the Imams, including Imam Hassan and Imam Hussain. And that's probably one of the reasons why it's not given, the actual events of Karbala and the life of Imam Husayn bin Ali is not given as much attention, affection and importance as a result of the people who are actually writing history. Because again, canonization is another important aspect we actually need to talk about, that history is presented in certain way, and people are expected just to accept one version of events or one historical narrative, whereas the avid reader or the researcher will actually look at different views in terms of establishing what actually happened, what were the events that led to the martyrdom of Husayn bin Ali, what were the significance, what were the ramifications of those particular events. And unfortunately, it has been glossed over by the Umayyads, but it's not surprising because they wouldn't want to present history in a way that shows them in a negative light. And I think that's one of the reasons why many Muslims are not aware of the personality of Husayn ibn Ali.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Sheikh, and inshallah we hope that we'll see you again in future programs.
Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to take part in this dialogue.
It can be seen that while undoubtedly Husayn ibn Ali is considered a significant figure in the Muslim world, the way in which he is remembered differs, owing to historical accounts being advanced by those who seized the reins of power. My next interview is with Dr. Amira Benison, who is a Fellow of Magdalen College, Cambridge. Her work looks in particular at how groups consolidate their political legitimacy. I will be asking how the Umayyads did this in light of the tragedy of Karbala. So thank you very much for giving your time for this interview. And the first question I wanted to ask was, how did the Umayyads develop court life?
I mean, the Umayyads are really the first dynasty of Islam, and they are the first to actually try and develop some kind of court culture. Before that, life was much simpler. During the Prophet's own time, or the rightly guided caliphs based in the Hijaz, in Medina. They operated a fairly simple kind of lifestyle. People had easy access to them. But once the Umayyads had moved the capital to Damascus, which was a sensible geopolitical choice, I mean, emotionally, people's hearts were in the Hijaz, but from a practical perspective, to stay in touch with the armies, it was more sensible to be in Damascus. And there they became much more aware of how the empires before them had run their kind of ritual and court life. And they do take the Byzantine Empire in particular as a model and an example for how to run a court. Nonetheless, they do still remain quite accessible. I mean, it's one of the features of the Umayyad period that Arab chiefs still felt that they could go in and see the caliph, and he made efforts to make sure he was available, particularly in the earlier half of the Umayyad Caliphate, so that the tribal chiefs didn't feel that they'd been excluded.
So the Umayyads didn't revert back to the original tribal culture of Arabia, but it seems that they utilised Islam to consolidate their power. What were their methods for doing that?
I think this early stage in the history of Islam, nobody was really quite sure how to organise power, what the sources of authority were. Tribes remained hugely important, and I think one needs to remember that although the idea of being a Muslim had taken over to a certain extent from tribal identities, within the Muslim group itself, those tribal identities were still very important, and the Umayyads do rely on them to a certain extent. They do rely on tribal structures, but at the same time they try to create a new sense of power rooted in Islam itself and the idea of themselves as caliphs of the Prophet of God, or of God himself, in the sense of, you know, God's deputies or vice-regents on earth, which is probably an idea they actually calque, if you like, from the Byzantines, from the idea of the Byzantine emperor as the representative of God on earth.
How important was it for the Umayyads to take revenge upon members of the Prophet's family and to try to restore their own honour?
From the Umayyad perspective, the Alids were responsible in part for the death of Uthman ibn Affan because they hadn't stood against it, and they did feel that Ali himself hadn't appropriately taken revenge on the killers of Uthman. And certainly when it comes to reports about the death of Hussein, it's never presented directly as revenge. However, there are analogies drawn between what happened to Uthman and what then happened to Hussein.
Why did Yazid consider it so important to take the allegiance of Imam Hussain? I mean, couldn't he not have just continued consolidating his power without it?
Yazid could have proceeded without receiving the bay'ah or oath of allegiance from Hussein. But Hussein's family was so important, and there are hints in the sources that Muawiyah himself had agreed with Hassan previously that in the next generation, that the identity of the caliph would be decided by a shura, a consultative group, and Hussein would have been part of that consultative group. So there are hints that what Yazid is trying to do is that, having been named as next caliph by his father Muawiyah before his death, he received the oath of allegiance from those around him, but he was very, very keen then to try and secure the support of this group who would have made up the shura, which included not only Hussein but also Ibn Zubayr, another rival of the Umayyads based in the Hijaz. In addition, Yazid was very keen to get the allegiance of Hussein because he was a very popular figure. And that popularity was actually demonstrated, in fact, when the new Umayyad governor of Kufa, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, arrived, and people accidentally assumed it was Hussein and came out of their houses celebrating, sort of greeting him, saying, "Oh, Hussein, it's wonderful that you're here." And then somebody tapped them on the shoulder and said, it's not Hussein, it's Ubaydullah, the new governor. And then they all went away weeping and crying, which was said to have greatly irritated Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad and worried him because it made clear to him how popular Hussein actually was.
Do you think that Imam Hussain was aware that his movement towards Kufa would have been seen as a deliberate act of provocation towards Yazid? To what extent was he aware that it could well have led to his death?
I think Hussein probably is or was well aware that going to Kufa and to Iraq was a very dangerous move on his part. If we look at the historian At-Tabari, for instance, he gives a number of different perspectives and reports about this phase. And repeatedly people beg Hussein not to leave the Hijaz, not to leave Medina, not to go to Iraq, because it's going to be too dangerous. One might say that the initial and main provocation was, of course, the fact that he wouldn't give the oath of allegiance to Yazid. That was immediately making it clear that he did not support Yazid as caliph. So with that already on the table, for him to then go to Iraq, an area where Yazid wasn't sure about his support base, was definitely a provocation to Yazid, and people appear to have recognised it as such and begged him not to go, but he still chose to proceed.
To what extent has the Umayyad version of history influenced how historians have seen the Battle of Karbala?
Most of the sources that we have were redacted and compiled or brought together during the Abbasid era. So they actually reflect the view of the Abbasids, who perceived themselves as members of the Prophet's family, but his extended family rather than his direct descendants through Ali. So it's really their view which dominates, and they could be quite critical of the Umayyads. I think where we possibly see the Umayyads becoming more popular again is actually much later, in the Arab nationalist era, when the Arabs in the 19th and early 20th century were looking for, if you like, culture heroes and figures who were sort of founding fathers of Arab Islamic civilization. And the Umayyads were, at that phase, sort of reconstituted as these heroes. But I think in traditional historiography overall, I mean, there were many different positions, and some people were pro-Umayyad. But there was also quite a lot of ambivalence about them, because, you know, on the one hand, although they created an empire, they sustained an empire for 100 years and sort of set in train the development of Islamic civilization, they were responsible for the martyrdom of Hussein.
To what extent was the event of Karbala an embarrassment to the Umayyad Caliphate? And did they really successfully marginalise the event of Karbala?
I think it was a source of embarrassment, not for the Umayyad Caliphate as a whole, but for Yazid himself. But at the same time, I think it was a source of embarrassment for the Muslim community as a whole. because many, many people were implicated in the events, and in particular, in a way, the people of Iraq, and particularly the people of the city of Kufa, who had summoned Hussein, who had sent him letters begging him to come, offering him their support and allegiance, but who had then withdrawn it and not supported him at the last minute. So I think whilst the Umayyads were seen as culpable on one level, I think a lot of people felt that they were morally responsible in a more subtle way.
It seems that the Umayyads tried to spin the massacre at Karbala as them having managed to defeat a group of reprobates and criminals, although it did eventually come out, you know, this disaster of what has happened to the family of the Prophet. So how then did they go about engaging in damage containment, we might say?
Yeah, I think Yazid's reaction to the death of Hussein was in many ways an attempt to distance himself from what had happened. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as damage limitation. I think that's quite a modern way of looking at things. But I think he knew from the outset that it was a risky thing to do, to be in any way responsible for the death of the Prophet's grandson, even if not directly, but indirectly through giving the order. But I think his way of trying to minimize the damage was through trying to demonstrate that he was not happy that this had happened, that it had happened, but that it grieved him deeply that it had happened. And we see this repeatedly, in fact, in the narrative. All sorts of people who are involved on the Umayyad side, or involved in the sense of remaining neutral, do repeatedly voice in the texts that we have, in the sources that we have, their concern, their anxiety, their regret that they didn't actually prevent this happening, they didn't fight on the side of Hussein, or that they were in some way culpable for his death. I think just beyond that, the whole idea of damage limitation and, you know, the risk that Yazid took by allowing Hussein to be killed or authorizing it is the fact that he saw him as a greater risk alive overall than dead.
Do you think that new scholarship is starting to reappraise what happened at Karbala and look more into its depths and complexities?
I think most historians working on that period do try to sort of deconstruct the sources that we have and think about what happened at that time. I think it depends on your perspective how important you see it as being. Obviously, it's crucial in terms of the development of Shiism and the development of a sectarian split within Islam. But if you are looking, say, at the Umayyad Caliphate itself, then you might not see it as so central, but more as an event which occurred and which was widely lamented.
So that was a fascinating discussion, and thank you so much again for giving us your time, and look forward to seeing you in future documentaries. It can be understood from this discussion that there are complexities surrounding the relationship between the Umayyads and Abbasids that might not be immediately apparent. And since the narrative of Karbala was not so easily set aside, the issue became about how the Umayyads were to absolve themselves of any responsibility in order to consolidate their power as God's representatives on earth. I will be going to meet Professor Hugh Kennedy from the Department of the Languages and Cultures of the Near and Middle East at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London University. His books include titles such as The Great Arab Conquests, How the Spread of Islam Changed the World We Live In, and The Armies of the Caliphs, Military and Society in the Early Islamic State. Thank you very much, Professor Kennedy, for agreeing to give us this interview. And I was going to start with the first question that's really based on your research, which is, in your view, with regard to the Arab expansion after the death of the Prophet, Did the tragedy of Karbala play any significant role or have any particular impact on that expansion?
The tragedy at Karbala, of course, has a political dimension to it, which is well recorded in all the chronicles. It's a major political event, but it also has a equally important equal importance in the discussion of the development of the memory of Hussein, the way the memory of Hussein and his death becomes so important to the Shi'i, the proto-Shi'i, the emerging Shi'i community in Iraq. So it works at two levels, there's, as it were, the political level, but also the religious and emotional level that this event caused and so on. What it does affect, of course, is people's attitudes to Umayyad rule. And it consolidates that opposition to Umayyad rule that emerged in Iraq in the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and his caliphate and so on, and the way that the people of Iraq were resistant to Umayyad rule, really because, as much as anything else, it was Syrian rule. And you get from very early on in Islamic history this rivalry, if you like, between the Muslims of Iraq and the Muslims of Syria. So, and of course the house of the Prophet, the house of Ali, is connected very early on with the Iraqis and the Iraqi side from the time that Ali was caliph. And so the Hussein's arrival in Iraq and his death is simply part of that story.
In your view, how were the ethics and vision of Islam modified to accommodate an expanding military and economic power?
I think that in the first century of Islam, people were really debating and in some cases struggling with the idea of how do you reconcile the simple ethics of the Islamic religion and Quran and beginnings of Sunnah and so on, with the complexities of running what was, by the standards of the time, a very advanced state. It has a taxation system and administration, it mints money, it pays salaries, it has all the makings of a state, which are things which were completely lost in Western Europe at the time. And there is a tension between these two things, I think, and some of that is expressed in the reaction to Hussein's death, which is in some ways a reaction to this growing power of the state, the growing power of the bureaucracy and things like that. But it's something worth remembering, I think, that the reverence or the respect for the house of Ali and the house of the Prophet was something that wasn't just confined to a small Shi'i group or proto-Shi'i group, but was widespread, and accounts in Sunni historians of the death of Hussein. And Tabari, for example, Great History of the Prophets and Kings, which is the text we really rely on more than any other. The death of Hussein is considered as a tragedy, partly because he was the grandson of the Prophet, and he'd known the Prophet well. The Prophet had famously been very fond of his grandsons. And so it's not a strictly, you're not one thing or the other necessarily. As I said, the respect for the family of the Prophet stretches all through the Muslim community.
How do you feel that Karbala has been depicted in historical texts on Islamic history?
Well, you do get a divergence of historical texts, particularly from the 10th century onwards, and you get a whole, as it were, the whole tragedy of Karbala is developed predominantly in Shi'i texts in a way that it isn't in Sunni texts, particularly the tales of the suffering of Hussein and his family. And there is this whole very live issue of the repentance, the Tawabun in Kufa. Remember that Hussein had been invited to come from Medina, where he was safely living, to Iraq by the people of Kufa in order to assume the rule, and they would support him against the Umayyads and so on. And when he gets there, the people of Kufa do nothing. They don't come and help him. And this is a major element in the development of the whole tragic narrative. They said they were going to, and they don't. And then when the tragedies happened, when Hussein is dead, and so on, then there was a widespread movement of really sort of shame amongst the people of Kufa that they hadn't come out and welcomed and rescued the grandson of the Prophet and so on. So you get, immediately there is a strong emotional element here right from the beginning, and these people, the people of Kufa in a sense mobilize and they come out and fight the Umayyads, and it's more an emotional commitment than anything else, and it turns out to be militarily futile because the Umayyads are just better organized and so on. So it's a classic example of the struggle of the of the holy man and his disciples against political and military power.
Next stop is to meet Professor Sajjad Rizvi, Director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, to ask him about the nature and range of sources that are available by means of which we can grasp a better knowledge of the history of Husayn ibn Ali's life. Thank you very much, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, for giving us your time to talk about how we can approach the person of Imam Hussain alayhi salam in the sources. I wanted to ask, first of all, what can we gather about the life of Imam Hussain alayhi salam from the early sources before the events of Karbala?
I think it depends on what you mean by the early sources and which ones you're looking at. There's, of course, a fair amount of material in the Shia sources on three areas of his life. Of course, there is his early life, from his birth up to the demise of the Prophet and of his mother, of course.
Yeah.
So the early life of being part of, I guess, what you might call a holy family. Then there is a short period under the rule of his father, Amir al-Mu'mineen.
Yeah.
And then, to a large extent, it jumps to the events at Karbala. But usually, when you look at the Shia sources, the whole of the life of the Imam is about a sort of a teleological progression towards Karbala.
Right.
And Karbala, in a sense, is the culmination of his life. It's the purpose of his life. And that's very clear when you look at some of the early sources which mention his birth. And, the Prophet's grieving at his birth, being told by Gabriel about the martyrdom, having the earth of Karbala, presented to him, which he then presents to his wife, Salma.
Okay, thank you. And what are the differences, what can we detect about the differences in the way that Imam Hussain alayhi salam is presented in the Sunni sources and the Shi'i sources? Can we detect any differences there?
I think, of course, you have the commonalities, being a beloved grandson of the Prophet, being a respected person, of his family and of his time. So that doesn't change whether it's in Medina, whether it's in Kufa and other places.
Yeah.
Of course, you do have Sunni sources which do mention the letters which were written to him from Kufa, inviting him to rebel against Yazid, or to reject the allegiance of Yazid and pledging their allegiance to him. That's all there in the sources because of his prominence. But then, of course, you get other things which come up in the Sunni sources, which I think there's an element of trying to humanize someone, or perhaps a more cynical person would be to normalizing his status. And that's about, his relationship with his wives and so forth. And you find those sorts of reports do come up about, those who the Shia tradition calls imams, in a way to show that they were just ordinary human beings. And that's very much with failings and shortcomings and passions like anger and love and sort of intense feelings, which certainly don't fit within a straightforward Shiite theological perspective of who the Imam should be.
With regard to how Imam Hussain alayhi salam is portrayed in the Masa'ib and the narratives of the Masa'ib, how far does that go back? Is that based on, say, a chain that might go, a chain of, we could say, not narration, but a tradition that goes back to the early period, or was that developed later?
Well, we do have maqatil literature, which is quite early.
Yeah.
And of course, famously, you have Abu Mikhnaf, who is a Kufan tradent, whose work is extant in Tabari and other sources. And that gives you already a fairly clear account of what happened, often in exactly the same order as we have in much later maqatil. But there's not much detail. And there's not much detail quite simply because in most early sources you don't have very much detail. Interestingly, of course, you do have some poetry, the rajas, which would have been recited, by fighters in battles. Some of that material is very early, and we know that from other sources, for example, on the Battle of Siffin, or on Jamal, where you have poetry from that period. You, of course, have poetry from the battles during the time of the Prophet, which are also extant in the biographies of the Prophet, such as the Ibn Hisham, the life by Ibn Hisham. So that sort of material is already there. Of course, what we now know in terms of the recounting of what happened at Karbala, that, broadly speaking, follows a structure which is much later. That's predominantly 15th, 16th century, goes back to Kashifi's Rawzat al-Shuhada, and of course, as we know, Kashifi was not a Shia figure, he was a Sunni figure, so that narrative, which is a Persian narrative, which influenced the Persianate world, which was both Sunni and Shia from that period onwards, that's the one which is dominant. And what then happens is the later maqatil, which we have, which are popular, which then manifest themselves in actual majalis that people listen to and see and hear. Those works are then based on Kashifi's account.
And another point with, of course, with, I suppose, our concern is letting people know about, the mission of Imam Hussain, alayhi salam. This comes around every year. There's this concern for letting people know about him. And I've had my personal experiences as well of being at interfaith gatherings or telling non-Muslims about him and about Karbala. And every time they have responded with a kind of astonishment that they didn't know about it before and that they've never heard about it. And consternation, because they're saying, well, this is an important event and I know many Muslims and I've never heard about this from them. We've also got this issue with, obviously, how the history of Islam has always been written, and it's been said the last few years that even non-Muslim writers of Islamic history tend to present that history from the perspective of the victors, or the apparent victors, we could say. So there is this talk of a revisionist approach to early Islam. What is this revisionist approach? What's going on with this?
Well, before I get to that, let me just say something about the writing of the history first. Certainly most Islamic history, if we're talking about the primary sources, is written from the perspective of a triumphalist imperial Islam. And that triumphalist imperial Islam is very much about the Umayyads and the Abbasids. It's about power, it's about sort of the general narrative of imperial rule, imperial ideology, enforcing the law, having the power to enforce your will, right? And within that, there's actually very little space for principles. There's very little space for principal action. There's certainly very little space for what is material loss. And there is a very willful requirement to deal with the trauma of civil war. And the way you deal with the trauma of the early civil wars is, broadly speaking, you brush it away. You don't ask the question of why was Imam Hussain killed, who was responsible for it, and even if you do want to engage in that, you want to try and minimize the responsibility coming back to the caliphal center, because the broad strokes of that imperial Islamic historiography is to exonerate the caliph and to protect caliphal power. So Yazid ultimately cannot be responsible. Now, of course, that's not the way the devotional literature works and never has worked, but certainly the broad sort of brushes of imperial Islamic history work in that way. And that, to a large extent, has also then impacted upon more recent academic work, certainly in the last century or so, which accepts those accounts and tends to look at sort of Shi'i counter-narratives as basically sectarian literature. It is so the broad brushstrokes of, say, Tabari constitutes history, the broad brushstrokes of Sayyid, etc., constitute mere political theology or rhetoric. The fact of the matter is, or propaganda, in fact, yeah. The fact of the matter is, all of this stuff is rhetorical writing. All of these works are trying to present and make a certain type of case that's very clear. So Tabari is making a certain type of case which is about caliphal power, which is about how caliphal power is the rightful and continuous continuation of prophetic power and prophetic authority. The Shi'i works are again making a certain type of claim about the nature of sacred and political authority after the Prophet. So they're all making certain types of cases. So it doesn't really make sense to call one history and the other one purely rhetoric or propaganda. Now, then you have the revisionist turn, which particularly since the 1970s, which was always about saying, well, look, we know the early Muslim sources are late, they are partial, they are biased, so perhaps we should look at non-Muslim sources. Not always rather honestly admitting that they're going to be biased in their own way. You know, when you're looking at, say, Christian or Jewish apocalyptic material and trying to, you know, find out something about early Islam, that has its own problems. You know, apocalyptic literature is theological by definition. It's not straightforward chronicles, and even the chronicles that we do have, which are in many cases written by clergymen, are still not devoid of theological significance. Of course, if you do look at the broad brushstrokes of that sort of revisionist history which is being written based on non-Muslim sources, that corroborates a certain imperial Islamic vision, particularly when some of those early sources are coming out of Syria. So they're basically accepting, in effect, Umayyad perspectives on early history. And within that, Imam Hussain, Karbala barely gets a mention. In fact, in most cases, does not get a mention at all.
Do you think that enough is being done in the field of Shi'i studies and by lovers of Ahlulbayt and Shias in general to address the fact that these writers that may be relatively influential, say among university students or people who want to look a little bit deeper into Islam, so they've got some influence, is enough being done to counter this? And to raise awareness of the importance of Karbala, Imam Hussein's...
I mean, I think Shi'i studies as a field is growing. And certainly 20, 30 years ago, there was hardly any work being done at all. Now, it tends to have been skewed in certain directions, you know, the study of law, sometimes, you know, the study of very particular hadith or looking at the formation of the tradition. There hasn't really been much about Shi'i approaches to history as such. I mean, there are a few studies here and there, and certainly not ones which I can think of maybe only one or two articles which are specifically on Karbala insofar as it's about the writing of history. So there's not actually that much work out there. And that's, I think, partly because of the polemics surrounding the study of the early period. People tend to stay away from it. If you are a young academic, you could make your way in the early period if you're going to make a splash with certain sort of radical ideas. But on the whole, it's potentially more likely to bury you than to make you. So sometimes people tend to be a bit reluctant. Even if you look at the field of Quranic studies, there are really not very many Muslims who are involved in that. And I think that's at least one of the reasons why you get such wild kind of positions being put forward in Quranic studies.
Just to come up to the end of the discussion, we've seen that the historical sources have, in a sense, portrayed the expansion of Islam from an Umayyad perspective, and they have marginalized what Imam Hussain alayhi salam did, what happened at Karbala, that's been marginalised. And there have, in a sense, been produced versions of Islam that of course, non-Muslims, they don't understand what is the origin of these different versions of Islam. What would you say are the characteristics of the Umayyad take on Islam, and what are the characteristics of Husseini Islam?
In terms of Umayyad Islam, it is basically imperial, legal, exoteric, even if you want to call it that, Islam as people know it.
Yeah.
It's all about the production and sustenance of power, and it's about the law as a protection of particularly caliphal central power and also of the public order. What then becomes Sunni Islam is fundamentally about protecting that public space, that public order in which the supremacy of the caliph's power is not questioned. So, broadly speaking, pre-modern Sunni Islam is very uncomfortable with resistance. It's very uncomfortable with rebellion. It's very uncomfortable with anything beyond a light kind of verbal disagreement with what those in authority are doing. And this is often defended and justified through recourse to Quranic verses which talk about rendering allegiance to those who are in authority. The whole notion of how authority is then justified through power becomes absolutely central. Now, what of course you have in the Shia conception, and Imam Hussain kind of exemplifies that, is that, well, authority is authority regardless of power.
Yeah.
The representatives of God are the representatives of God, whether anyone takes any notice of them or not, whether anyone follows them or not, whether they wield power or not. With the classic theological formulation being that the Imam is the Imam whether he is literally sitting or standing, so whether he has power or whether he is sitting in the mosque and just teaching his followers. So that's very clear, but also the principle of how you behave and deal with individuals, that you deal with people with compassion. That's very important. You do not brutalize people. You do not, if you kill someone, you do not kind of mutilate their body. You do not behead them. You do not crucify them if you disagree with them. And in that case, what the Imam then represents is a continuation of what his grandfather represents and what his father represented. And that's very important. So what the Imam was then standing up for, and how I think people afterwards see him, is he is then defending the authentic legacy of the Prophet.
Thank you very much, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, for a very detailed and interesting discussion. This discussion has shown how specific perceptions of the purpose of Husayn ibn Ali's life may have influenced what we have available to us in terms of early hadith sources and narratives about his life. Histories of Husayn ibn Ali are also to be gleaned from different poetic forms and types of recitation, as well as details that mention his life in prose. Throughout this investigation on how the person of Husayn ibn Ali has been portrayed in the historical sources, it has been seen that it's very important for us to understand who has produced these historical texts, what were their motives for producing them, and what are the different forms and sources that we can learn from to put together a picture. It can be seen that politics, the social issues, social matters, economics, propaganda, all of these ingredients have gone in to how the person of Husayn ibn Ali has been portrayed. I would argue that there's still much work to be done in Western academia on coming to understand who Husayn ibn Ali was and what his philosophy was and his reasons for taking the stand that he did.